Hey there, welcome back to Sleepless Historian. Tonight, we're going to drift quietly, slowly into the strange, charmingly odd, and sometimes truly baffling things people once did for fun in medieval times, and a little beyond. So, if you're listening late at night with the lights low, maybe under a blanket or with a cup of something warm beside you, you're in the right place. Just take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. There's nothing you need to do for the next few hours except listen. If you'd like, you can gently press the like button or subscribe. It helps these sleepy wanderings find other restless souls. And as our little nighttime ritual goes, leave a quiet comment sometime telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always lovely to imagine this strange little worldwide tavern of sleepy historians, all gathered around their phones or glowing screens. Now, as always, settle in, dim the lights, lie back. We're heading into a time when life was muddy, loud, smoky, sweaty, and somehow still full of laughter. Let's explore the strange things people did for fun in the medieval world. The night is long. Let's wander slowly. Some evenings in medieval towns began the same way, bells echoing across rooftops, smoke rising from hearths, the faint smell of roasted onions and beer drifting through crooked wooden streets. Small taverns crackled with voices. The world outside might have been harsh and uncertain, but indoors, for a few hours, laughter filled the gaps that faith and famine left behind. People found endless ways to amuse themselves, and many of them now seem, well, questionable, or dangerous, or just wonderfully silly. Let's start gently with drink and chaos. In a dim tavern somewhere in 14th century England, the benches creaked under tired shoulders. A jug of ale sat in the middle, and the evening's entertainment required no stage or permission. They called it ale stakes. It wasn't really a game, more a primitive drinking race. Alewives, women who brewed and sold beer-hung branches or poles outside their doors, so that villagers would know they had a fresh batch ready, and locals would wander in, greeting friends, comparing whose brew was stronger, and sometimes betting on who could drink more before rolling under the table. Medieval people loved wagers. It was one of their favorite ways to turn anything into sport. Counting coins, counting mugs. The tavern air was thick with smoke and rough laughter. Someone might start singing a tune that halfway dissolved into hiccups. Someone else might accidentally set their sleeve aflame from leaning too close to the candle. And somehow, everyone still called it fun. But there was charm too. In a working world where 6 days were labor, and the 7th belonged to God, this muddy, noisy reprieve was pure freedom. It wasn't about getting drunk, though. They did. It was about letting life feel warm for a bit. And yet not all games stayed gentle. In the alleys outside, boys played bandy ball, something halfway between hockey, chaos, and destruction. They used wooden sticks, sometimes shovels, and a ball of rags or leather. Streets were narrow, and windows fragile. Several laws are recorded from city councils begging people to please stop playing this game, near important buildings, or near anyone's face. The medieval world had few real sports, but endless improvised ones. Wrestling matches in the mud, foot races through market squares, Stick fighting contests that began as demonstrations of skill and ended with broken noses. Fun and violence were neighbors then. Most people didn't see them as opposites. And when the church frowned, saying these games distracted from prayer, the faithful murmured their apologies and went right back to playing after Mass. But that takes us quietly to another favorite amusement festivals. Imagine a whole town turning itself inside out for a few days. The Feast of Fools, for instance, where the lowest clergy members mocked the high priests. Bells rang backwards, roles were reversed. People dressed as animals or kings or bishops, sometimes all three. At the heart of it all was something nearly pagan in spirit, a deep, human need to laugh at order itself. Imagine masked faces gleaming in candlelight, wine sloshing, people dancing in circles until no one remembered who was meant to be dignified anymore. Chroniclers often called these celebrations scandalous, but quietly, historians now admit that the laughter probably did more good than harm. It was pressure released, a communal exhale. Not all medieval joy came from noise, though sometimes people entertained themselves through what we'd probably call pain games. Beauty, in those days, involved discomfort. Young nobles might try eyebrow plucking contests, or shape their hairline to achieve that high forehead fashion prized at court. Some even wiped their skin with vinegar or ashes, convinced it gave a luminous, angelic pallor. Even bathing could turn into strange ritual. In castles, bathhouses were social events. There were servants pouring scented water, musicians playing, even dice games at the tub's edge. Things got rowdy, and the line between hygiene and hedonism was, let's say, flexible. Meanwhile, peasants bathed rarely, but found their fun by the village well, splashing, teasing, and occasionally pushing someone in. Because in every century, people find a way to turn inconvenience into laughter. But meantime, in another corner of medieval life, fun meant animals. Roosters were bred for fighting, bears chained in pits to taunt dogs. Cats were, disturbingly, sometimes part of carnival games, tossed or chased. Their cries mixed with cheers. To us, it's grim, but to them, it was spectacle, danger, and chaos contained just enough to feel safe. Men would bet money, meat, even clothing on the outcomes. The church scolded everyone, and the next week, people showed up again anyway. Still, not every animal story was cruel. Monkey performers and dancing dogs followed fairs across Europe, bringing small crowds of children. Farmers grew fond of trained birds that imitated human whistles in quiet moments. Even harsh laughter softened into wonder, and slowly, as the candles burned lower, the laughter of taverns gave way to songs. Storytelling was the medieval world's greatest. Entertainment, long ballads about knights and ghosts, travelers and fools. One person spoke while others drank, or sewed, or simply stared into firelight. Sometimes they told heroic sagas, but often the audience preferred the comic ones, the tales of tricksters, cuckolded husbands, clever wives. Those stories drifted from cottage to cottage for centuries. A medieval meme, in its way, and in that quiet rhythm, the day softened into night again. Fields waited, bells would toll, but for this moment, fun had been found. Night comes early in the medieval world. And as the shadows stretched over thatched roofs and cobbled lanes, people sought warmth wherever laughter flickered. Inside a tavern, someone tuned a crude lute. Others gathered round, cups clinking, ready for a game called Hoodman Blind. It's what we'd now call blind man's bluff. One person was blindfolded with a sack or hood, spun around until dizzy, then let loose to find the others by sound alone. The onlookers giggled as chairs scraped and ale spilled. A hand brushed a shoulder, a shriek followed, and the blindfolded one lunged in the wrong direction entirely. It wasn't just children who played. Even grown men joined in, because when light is short and winter's endless, silliness becomes sacred. Outside, frost gathered on the eaves. Inside, time stood still. The hood came off, laughter echoed, and someone suggested another round. Elsewhere, across the channel, winter meant something louder: festivals of misrule. In France and England, during the cold months, entire parishes abandoned decorum for brief, glorious chaos. Servants dressed as masters, priests swapped vestments with choir boys. A lord of misrule was chosen the fool who ruled the feast, commanding absurdity for a few days each year, and people obeyed. They danced in circles, sang saucy songs, paraded through town halls with mock processions. In some villages, men dressed as women. In others, animals were given mock roles in the church. To outsiders, it looked unholy. To the people inside it, it felt freeing. For those few days, laughter was stronger than hierarchy. And when it was over, everyone went quietly back to their work, perhaps sighing a little as they put the world in order. Again, in cities, fun often took rougher forms. London, for example, had its own winter entertainment, throwing snowballs at night guards. It wasn't official, of course, but it happened often enough to earn mention in records. Wardens complaining about youths of the city who couldn't resist pelting overseers with packed snow. If the guards chased them, the snowballs turned to mischief with stones inside. City officials called it riotous. Young people called it hilarious. And somewhere between those two truths, human nature remained wonderfully unchanged. During warmer months, towns came alive with processions and pageants. Imagine a wooden cart rolling through the street, covered in flowers and banners. Upon it, costumed locals performed small dramas, biblical stories, morality plays, farces about millers and maidens, anything to delight the crowd. Children sat on the ground in front. Bakers leaned out of doorways. For one afternoon, the grey cobbles turned into a stage, and everyone forgot their chores. The plays themselves were simple, but the laughter was generous. It was a shared dream between audience and players, rough, imperfect, and deeply alive. Of course, not all amusements needed an audience. Picture a shepherd high on a misty hill in Wales or France, guarding his flock at dusk. To pass the time, he carved bone flutes or whittled small toys from wood. When wind whistled through the valleys, he played simple tunes, repeated fragments of melody that drifted like old memories. Music, for most medieval people, wasn't performance. It was company. A voice, however untrained, was part of daily life. The washing song, the harvest chant, the cradle lullaby hummed under one's breath. Fun, in that sense, wasn't only laughter. It was rhythm, the heartbeat of survival softened by melody. But back in taverns, where candles burned low and ale ran out too soon, other amusements took shape. Story games, for instance. One person would begin a tale, and others took turns adding absurd details until the story collapsed under its own nonsense. A knight rides to rescue a maiden. Someone starts. But by the fifth turn, the knight has lost his horse, his armor turned into bread, and the maiden's a talking trout. The players roar with laughter, and someone swears that next time they'll make an even sillier story. And they do. Night after night, even literacy wasn't required. The best storytellers were often those who'd never touched parchment. They were the memory of their generation, keeping tales alive purely by sound and smoke and patience. Traveling jesters and minstrels added spice to this world of rough joy. Some were brilliant entertainers, others wandering tricksters who juggled, sang bawdy songs, and told half-true news from far-off lands. For a cup of wine and a coin, they offered not just amusement, but connection urban gossip carried to lonely villages. Bits of melody that survived centuries because of those wandering voices. Sometimes, jesters became more influential than priests. Monarchs like Henry II or Edward I kept fools at court not merely for laughter, but for truth disguised as jest. The fool could speak freely when others could not, and all across Europe, laughter thus became a strange, subtle instrument of honesty. But that laughter could be dangerous too. In markets and courts, people enjoyed public punishments as gruesome entertainment. A thief whipped, a drunkard placed in the stocks crowds gathered, not out of cruelty, but curiosity. It was spectacle, routine, and warning all at once. Families brought bread to watch. Children pointed. Adults whispered jokes. It seems horrifying today, but in their world, such displays were both caution and pastime. When life was filled with uncertainty, perhaps knowing exactly who had angered the law provided order, and a curious unity, laughter, even cruel laughter, was a social glue. Still, the heart of medieval fun lay somewhere between pain and play, reverence and ridicule. The same people who sang solemn hymns at sunrise might host wrestling matches behind the church by sunset. Their faith didn't erase their joy, it framed it. Every saint's day held to halves, prayer and revel. The morning for God, the night for dancing, cider, and songs half remembered. Each season brought its own rites-made day with ribbons, harvest festivals with bonfires, winter with mumming plays and hot wine. Every generation adding details, jokes, and games that no scribe thought worth recording. But they mattered to the people as tiny acts of resistance against silence. And maybe that is the truest thing about medieval fun. It wasn't tea leisure the way we know it. It was catharsis. It was survival through joy. A tired farmer laughed because otherwise he'd collapse. A weary monk joked because otherwise he'd weep. And the laughter that rolled out from those stone villages, across fields and forests, is still somewhere in the wind. Even now, if you pause long enough in an old square after midnight, you might imagine it faintly. A barrel rolled down a lane, a lute string plucked a cheer that once meant nothing at all, yet somehow meant everything. As the centuries turned and the world tilted gently toward the early modern age, The strange amusements of the medieval world did not disappear. They simply changed costumes. The taverns became inns, the fairs grew grander, and the people, though dressed differently, laughed in the same familiar ways. Maybe the ale tasted a little stronger, maybe the music sounded sweeter, but the reasons for joy didn't change. And so, the story goes on. Imagine a 16th century English village on a summer evening. The fields buzz with insects, the bells of the church tower ring softly, and the square smells faintly of yeast, grass, and smoke. Tonight's entertainment is rush bearing. It sounds dull enough, but in truth, it was anything but. Villagers gathered reeds or rushes from the riverbanks and brought them to the church decorated with ribbons, garlands, and sometimes the odd mug of ale in hand. What began as a simple act of keeping the church floor fresh and dry became, predictably, a festival. There were drums, music, and dancing. Someone always brought livestock adorned with flowers. Another person brought a fiddle. And before long, the ceremony turned into celebration. It's telling, isn't it? Even a cleaning chore could become a party if you lived in the 16th century long enough. Meanwhile, across Europe, public theatres sprouted like noisy mushrooms after rain. In London, Shakespeare-esque globe rose on the south bank of the Thames, a wooden ring filled with thousands of people pressed shoulder to shoulder. They came not just for the poetry, but for the chaos. A hot day at the theatre meant shouting, eating, jeering, laughing, even throwing fruit at bad actors. One could watch kings murdered, ghosts walk, lovers swoon, all for a few pennies. It was theatre as carnival, and for people leaving fields or smithies, it was magic enough to make even the dirty river breeze smell almost good. The church, predictably, muttered disapproval, but secretly, even some clergy slipped in among the crowds to lose themselves in stories. Because sometimes the mind needs more than sermons, it needs spectacle. Spectacle, in fact, became Europe's favorite pastime. Renaissance courts adored it. The monarchs of France, Spain, and Italy competed to throw the most elaborate masquerades, grand night gatherings, where nobles wore masks of gold and velvet, danced under chandeliers, and spoke in exaggerated poetry. Behind each mask was freedom. For one night, no one knew who flirted with whom, who whispered forbidden rumors, who watched from the shadows. It was, in every sense, beautifully human mischief. And when the last song ended, the masks were removed and propriety returned, slightly dented, but intact. Far to the north, in the Netherlands, city festivals combined piety with absurdity. Parades wound through narrow streets filled with banners and laughter, followed by feasting that lasted days. Even children joined contests of strength and wit, lifting buckets, racing across slick planks, reciting rhymes until giggles overtook them. Painters like Peter Bruegel captured these scenes in their early modern canvases, the smallness, the joy, the earthy humor of peasants dancing, slipping, drinking, kissing behind barns. Each painting is, in a way, a lost YouTube archive of 16th century silliness. You can almost hear the same sounds if you look long enough. Violins out of tune, dogs barking, the soft splash of ale spilling on wooden tables. But fun wasn't limited to Europe anymore. Trade and exploration carried laughter just as easily as spices and silk. In Ottoman Istanbul, storytellers recited comic tales at coffee houses, their audiences sipping thick, sweet coffee instead of ale, each tale twisted with irony, poking fun at greedy merchants or foolish scholars. A few listeners dozed, others chuckled quietly. The city hummed with the same rhythm as medieval inns, only the architecture had changed. In China's imperial cities, acrobats performed with porcelain dishes balanced on poles. Storytellers chanted legendary epics by London light. Crowds gathered, laughing softly, while children tugged at their parents' robes to stay longer. And in the palaces of India, dancers and musicians filled long evenings with rhythm and motion. They told stories not with words, but with the tilt of a hand, or the glance of an eye. Elegant games for kings and courtiers who had already seen too many wars. The surface of joy differed, but the heart of it was the same. Everywhere, humanity chased delight like a candle's flicker on a long night. And yet, as centuries passed, something peculiar happened. The more civilized society became, the more controlled its amusements grew. By the 1700s, the tavern's wild laughter found itself replaced by refined parlors and polite games. A new fad appeared among ladies and gentlemen alike. Parlor games, the ancestors of charades, riddles, and whispers. They played until midnight, laughing behind lace fans. Guests guessed words, drew objects blindfolded, told ghost stories by firelight, or invented nonsense poems. The sane human need lingered beneath, the thrill of foolishness, carefully wrapped in manners. The laughter was quieter now, but no less sincere. Of course, the universities and monasteries never lost their taste for strange fun either. Students across Europe found endless ways to annoy their professors. Records from Oxford and Paris mention young scholars racing geese through cloisters, composing rude poems in Latin, and holding mock disputations where nonsense arguments were defended with scholarly seriousness. Can you picture it? A whole classroom pretending to debate whether angels prefer cheese or fish on Fridays, and doing it in perfect classical grammar. For all their learning, they remained gloriously human. Sometimes laughter grew political. During the Reformation and the centuries after, pamphlets, woodcuts, and plays mocked religious opponents with biting humor. They were the internet memes of their age, cartoons of priests as pigs or nobles as donkeys, each printed by candlelight and smuggled through city streets. And though censors tried to confiscate them, the jokes survived. They always do, because nothing travels faster than forbidden laughter. Meanwhile, the rural villages kept their old games alive. Maypoles were raised each spring. Fiddles sang across meadows. Married couples competed in wife-carrying races, a tradition that survives in parts of Europe. Even now, young men leapt over bonfires on midsummer nights. Girls tossed garlands into rivers to foresee love. If the garland drifted toward the shore, the year ahead was lonely. If it stayed afloat, promises of romance awaited. Every generation added its own symbols, but beneath it all was that same earthy joy. Life is short, love is strange, and we may as well laugh about it. Beyond Europe, festival times held the same spark. In West African kingdoms, drumming festivals brought entire towns together. The music never stopped. People danced until dawn, laughter dissolving into rhythm. Nearby, storytellers known as griots recited the lives of kings and heroes with humor and song, keeping memory alive through joy. In the Americas, indigenous peoples celebrated the seasons with dances, painted masks, and games that balanced competition with ceremony. Participants played not only for victory, but for the spirit of the community fun intertwined with reverence. Just as in medieval Europe, the sacred and the silly lived side by side, inseparable. By the 18th and 19th centuries, city life birthed new entertainments, coffee houses, puppet theaters, street performers, and early circuses. In Paris, acrobats swung above crowds in candlelit courtyards. In London, people gathered to watch magic lantern shows, early projections of images that shimmered ghost-like on walls. For families weary of long working days, these spectacles were small miracles. Light, laughter, illusion, the same ingredients that filled taverns centuries earlier. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the new amusements, older echoes remained. Every fairground still carried the medieval scent of roasted meat and spilled ale. Every laughter ring held memories of the Feast of Fools. Even in new cities with clean streets and lamplight, people still gathered in corners, laughing at jokes that priests would never approve. It's the heritage of humanity's mischief, passed quietly from century to century. No one writes it down, yet it never disappears. As the world modernized, the tools of fun changed, but the feelings didn't. Spectacle found its way to the printed page, serialized adventure stories, satirical newspapers, illustrated mockery of politics and society. Those same impulses that made peasants laugh at jesters made city dwellers laugh at caricatures of aristocrats in wigs or politicians caught in foolish scandals. Entertainment became refined, then romantic, then philosophical, but it was still, in essence, play. Still a moment for the mind to rest. And so, we begin to drift closer to the present. Through every century runs a single thread, the love of laughter under dim lights. The need for something pointless and human after the day's seriousness fades. Whether in a smoky tavern, a crowded theater, or a small glowing screen late at night, people are moved by the same gentle hunger to forget themselves, if only for a while. That ancient pastime has never really changed. The props improved, the sound got louder, but the desire to laugh in the dark remained. The world now hums more quietly. We've wandered through centuries of laughter and oddity, from muddy festivals to masked balls, from jesters to circus rings. And yet, there are still corners of history left unlit. Small rooms where laughter whispered a little differently. Let's open those gently, one last time. In the 19th century, the great age of industry came roaring. Smoke rose above cities, machines clattered, and time itself seemed to quicken. But even then, amid the noise, people clung to their small refuges of joy. Working men and women invented their own evenings of fun, dance halls, local cricket, public parks with brass bands on Sundays. Young families picnicked beside rivers that smelled faintly of coal dust. Children sailed paper boats, while their parents shared quiet cider on the grass. It was humbler than the pageantry of medieval feasts, perhaps, but no less sincere. A new honesty entered human joy. No banners, no nobles, just laughter echoing between factory walls. In the countryside, older customs survived longer. Villagers still leapt over bonfires at midsummer. Harvest homes ended with roasted goose and wild dancing. You can picture the flicker of torches, reflected in 100 smiling faces, the old world refusing to fade. Still finding warmth in rhythm and firelight, some parish priests, weary of scolding, simply joined in. Perhaps they understood that a few songs and foolish games did less harm than despair. Across the sea, in the Americas, new traditions bloomed, hybrids of old and new world joy. European settlers, indigenous rituals, African rhythms all melted together in carnival streets. Drums beat down alleys painted with color. Parades flowed like rivers of noise. The same spirit of medieval festivals reappeared here. Thousands of miles away, a shared heartbeat of misrule and dance. The faces were different. The stories were new, but the laughter, somehow, sounded ancient. There is something endlessly comforting about that idea, that no matter where or when you stand in history, human beings are still inventing peculiar ways to be happy. Think of a Roman tossing dice in marble halls, a Saxon boy spinning in mud, a courtly lady pretending to swoon at words of impossible poetry, a 19th century seamstress waltzing under gaslight. For distant souls bound together by the same absurd gift, amusement. Occasionally, history leaves us written traces of those small, strange joys. In one 17th century diary, a London tailor recorded great laughter after his neighbors raced wheelbarrows down a flooded lane. He noted that they spilt most of their beer, but the mirth was worth the loss. In another town, a young scholar complained that his friend taught a goose to follow him through the college courts. Too much disturbance. And somewhere in Germany, a baker proudly described his daughter winning the pastry throwing contest at the midsummer fair. These fragments are smaller than wars and kings, but perhaps more revealing. They show that joy was the one rebellion history could never tax. Back in Europe, the salons and parlors of the Enlightenment glowed with civilized wit. Philosophers debated fate and reason by candlelight, occasionally pausing to laugh over absurd word games. Voltaire, for instance, delighted in impromptu riddles that doubled as satire. Newton may have calculated orbits, but his contemporaries loved calculating nonsense. Even amongst genius, there was a need to play. Some evenings ended with polite applause, others with spilled wine and unprintable jokes, because intellect, when unwound, can be playful to and as centuries marched ever onward, the stage of humanity's fun grew larger, noisier. The 19th century gave us public fairs with mechanical rides, brass bands echoing against tin roofs, and bright paper tickets that felt like keys to wonder. Children who once played with carved wooden toys now rode spinning carousels, clutching horses painted gold. Steam turned joy into spectacle machines whirring where once only voices laughed. And yet, at the heart of it, nothing changed. The thrill, the giggle, the unexpected tumble into fun, it was all familiar. Old games dressed in gleaming brass and light. Even the darker amusements lingered. Blood sports faded slowly, replaced by staged dramas or exotic exhibitions pretending to be science. Crowds still gathered to see something shocking, still whispered about it for days. It was the same curiosity that once brought peasants to bear fights just wrapped in cleaner clothes. We may have traded mud for velvet, but fascination has always leaned a little toward the forbidden. People still paid to glimpse the edges of fear, safely packaged in performance. And more often than not, they laughed afterward, relieved and alive. As time flowed into modern centuries, the world learned new rhythms, music halls, film, sports, television, digital screens. But behind every glowing shape of entertainment, you can still trace those older outlines. Your favorite comedy sketch mirrors the carnival fool. Your late-night football match is a polished echo of the muddy peasant tournaments that kings once banned. Even scrolling through silly videos is not far from listening to a wandering jester spin nonsense in centuries ago. Every generation rediscovers what the last already knew. When life grows heavy, we make noise. We play, we laugh, and the night becomes a little kinder. If you listen closely enough, history hums like a lullaby, a soft reminder that the world has always been ridiculous and marvelous in equal measure. In every dusty century, there were people just like you yawning after a long day, sitting by the dim glow of a fire, listening to someone's voice tell stories about the silliness of humankind. They laughed quietly, stretched, and let the warmth carry them towards sleep. And so, the tradition continues. From medieval taverns to this quiet moment now. As the story draws to stillness. Imagine walking through one of those old towns after the revelry has ended. The fires are dying. The echoes of song are fading down narrow lanes. Lantern light trembles on cobblestones slick with dew. You pass the remnants of the evening, the stray garland, the overturned jug, the laughter still hovering faintly in the cool air. A cat darts between shadows. Somewhere, a church bell murmurs midnight, and you realize how endless this cycle of joy truly is. People danced, joked, risked, loved, and dreamed, and here we are, centuries later, remembering them, not for their battles or empires, but for their laughter. If you're still awake, you can take a slow breath now. The hard edges of the world soften in the dark. Somewhere inside, the old echo of a lute plays faintly, mingling with your own heartbeat. And maybe you smile knowing that you, too, belong to that long story of human foolishness and wonder. That while ages pass, laughter never does. So if you enjoyed this rambling journey, maybe leave a quiet like or softly subscribe, so I can whisper more of these forgotten worlds another night. But for now, close your eyes. Imagine the flicker of medieval candles turning slowly to stars, the noise of the tavern fading into wind across a field. The world grows gentle again. The past becomes still, and history, finally, rests beside you. Good night, and sleep well. Traveler in time. Hey guys, tonight, we drift quietly into a side of medieval warfare that almost no one on the battlefield ever spoke aloud because they didn't have the words for it. The noise of war could be deafening, but the silence that followed, it was worse. So if you're lying in bed right now letting your mind wander through distant centuries, let the candlelight in your imagination grow dim. Let the torches flicker against cold stone walls. And we'll travel together to the uneasy quiet that came after the Crusades, after the sieges. After the banners were folded when knights came home, and lay awake listening to ghosts that only they could hear. If you somehow find yourself drifting into this quiet corner of the past, tucked under your blanket like a worn cloak, and you want more stories like this one, quiet, strange, and a little sad, you can gently press that like button, maybe even subscribe. It helps this small candle of history keep burning. But don't worry about it now. You can just listen slowly. The strange thing about battle is that it never really ends when the fighting stops. The iron can be scrubbed clean. The blood can be washed from the blade. But somewhere, deep in the folds of the mind, in the same silence where prayers live, something keeps fighting. The medieval world understood this only through fragments through the uneasy eyes of knights who rode victorious from war, but could no longer find peace in prayer or sleep. Imagine the smell first. Wet earth crushed under thousands of boots. The faint sweetness of trampled grass mixed with sweat and smoke. A battlefield after sunset was a forest of silence, broken by groans and the clatter of loose armor. The living often lay among the dead, whispering the same words to themselves until they couldn't tell who heard them. "Lord, forgive me," they murmured again and again, until those words became the rhythm of breathing. And when at last someone said it's over, and the knights rode away, some were shaking so much that their reins barely stayed in their hands. It wasn't he always fear sometimes, it was simply that the body refused to stop what it had started. The trembling that had kept them alive refused to leave. The sound of a whetstone against steel would later bring it back. The flutter of a priest's robe in the wind. A kettle dropped in a kitchen. The first quiet night after battle was not truly quiet. The mind would keep replaying the field as though it were trying to fix something that had already happened. A knight might lie down on straw, still feeling his mail shirt pressing his skin, phantom weight over rock cuts. His ears would still ring from hours of shouting and steel. And when he closed his eyes, he would find himself back there under the same dark sky, but this time he could not move. Those who shared tents or barracks whispered about these moments. Some said their companions cried out in their sleep. Others woke thrashing, striking at shadows, shouting names as if an enemy had crept close. In the blackness, no one laughed. They just rolled over and pretended not to have heard. In daylight, they rarely spoke of it again. Back home, after the dust had settled, a different battle began. The families saw it first. The soldier who flinched when the church bell tolled. Who snapped at his children. Who sat awake through the night staring at the wall. There were no words like syndrome or trauma. They had only the language of spirits and humors, of sin and melancholy. The healer might say, too much black bile in the body. The priest might suggest a confession or perhaps a pilgrimage to clear the conscience. But rarely did anyone name the thing for what it was, a wound that bled inside the mind. Some knights described it as a weight on the chest, others as whispers at the edge of prayer. At times, they would stare at the sword they had once carried with pride and wonder whether it was cursed. The more educated among them read the Psalms for comfort, especially those that spoke of battle and deliverance, but the words often deepened their guilt rather than softened it. There is a strange kind of loneliness in being haunted by noise when the world has gone silent. Even in castles, with dogs sleeping by the hearth and servants moving about their duties. They would startle at small things, the clink of metal, the creak of a door, the rush of wind through a narrow slit window. Each sound might unravel them for a moment, send them back to that one terrible day. Monks who recorded confessions sometimes wrote about visions or visitations that tormented returning warriors. They noted trembling, uncontrollable weeping, and sudden fits of rage. The chroniclers tried to frame these afflictions within their spiritual understanding. If a knight dreamed of those he'd slain, a monk might write, "The devils cling to him for the blood he has spilled." But behind those words, you can feel another emotion, a sense of helpless compassion, perhaps even recognition. Many monks were veterans too. Picture a monk sitting in the dim chapel after Compline, the last prayers of the day. He listens as a weary knight whispers his sins in the darkness between them. Outside, the rain slides down the narrow glass like slow tears. The knight hesitates. How to confess fear? Fear was shameful in a world that exalted courage. He might say instead that he doubts God's mercy, that he cannot sleep, that he hears voices. The monk nods, murmuring gently. The candle wavers. It is not demonic. He thinks, but the words for despair are limited. He might, softly, prescribe fasting or carrying a relic during sleep. Some warriors, believing their dreams were punishments, wore fragments of holy bone under their tunics or tucked a saint's relic beneath their pillow. Others commissioned masses for the souls of those they killed. Some simply rode away again, seeking in new wars an old silence. You can almost hear the thought, if I fight again, maybe the noise will drown the echoes. And still the echoes came. The medieval world overflowed with theories for what made a man lose himself. The melancholy humor. For example, one of the four liquids thought to govern temperament was often blamed. Too much of it was said to bring sadness, sleeplessness, and dread. Physicians wrote that men who carried sorrow from the battlefield should be exposed to sunlight, music, gentle company. Others warned of vapors rising from the spleen. It seems quaint now, but it was their language for pain they could not see. A troubadour might weave these sorrows into song, carefully disguised. A verse about longing for a distant lady might, underneath, be a lament for lost comrades. Meanwhile, chroniclers writing court histories celebrated victories and miracles, brushing sorrow aside as weakness. After all, in ink, the dead stayed noble and stiffly quiet. But sometimes, in the margins of manuscripts, you find faint drawings of a man kneeling with his head in his hands, small sketches that look like grief carved between prayers. No documentation, just humanity peeking through. The artists, too, must have known. Imagine one such man, a veteran of a crusade decades after he returned. He's old now. He sits near a window, staring at the field where sheep graze peacefully. But in his mind, he still hears the bells of Jerusalem, the clash of iron, the screams that never ended properly. The sun glows through thin linen curtains. His hands tremble on the cup. His wife walks quietly, knowing the look in his eyes too well. When night falls, she lights a candle, though he insists he does not fear the dark. She just doesn't want to hear him wake shouting again. They tried everything. Minstrels sang soft songs to calm the heart. Apothecaries ground herbs, valerian, rosemary, poppy, wine, heavy and thick. became both medicine and curse. Sometimes, simply sitting near a warm fire helped a small circle of safety against the vastness of memory. But still, the past would find them. A physician of the 13th century once wrote that a knight's trembling after war was the soul's refusal to be silent. He did not mean it poetically, he meant it as observation. Chronic fears and night visions were, to him, proof that the spirit remembered what the flesh wanted to forget. Even common soldiers, peasants pressed into levy or mercenary bands suffered in ways no chronicler bothered to record. They carried the same images home, but without confessionals or relics or literate friends to explain them. Their cures were rougher, strong drink, folk prayers muttered at crossroads, herbal charms sewn into sleeves. Sometimes they took to wandering pilgrims without object. Others withdrew into strange, quiet lives, becoming shepherds, woodcutters, hermits. People called them touched, or holy, or mad. But maybe they were just tired. For centuries, madness had a strange dignity. The mad could be saints. The melancholic could be prophets. So a knight who muttered to unseen enemies might, if he were lucky, find himself treated as a man bewitched rather than condemned. His family might hide him rather than abandon him. Candlelight and prayer could fill the long hours until sleep grudgingly arrived. What's tragic and deeply human is that these patterns echo across all wars, in every age. But in medieval nights dark, smoky, and filled with the scent of damp wool and ash, the struggle was not understood as psychological, but spiritual. The war had left demons behind, and the knights, in their loneliness, believed those demons had their names. The candle in our story still burns gently. The night deepens, and the air grows colder around the memory of armor-cold iron set aside, yet somehow still hiding under the skin. There is something both noble and tragic about the image of a knight who cannot rest. His armor, once gleaming, gathers dust in a corner. His sword rusts slightly around the hilt, where sweat once soaked into the grip. He tells no one what he dreams, though his servants whisper about the nights when they hear him walking, barefoot, from one end of the hall to the other. Sometimes he stops and listens, as if expecting a trumpet. Sometimes he presses his hand against the wall and breathes, trying to remember which world he belongs to, the quiet one or the burning one. A historian writing in later centuries would call him troubled by melancholy. But melancholy was not mere sadness. It was almost an element of the soul, a weighty fog that could thin or thicken depending on one's humors, one's choices, or perhaps one's past. It was the way they explained pain without evidence. In the shadowy hours, that explanation became a kind of mercy. Inside medieval minds, demons were real. To dream of ghosts was not metaphorical, it was dangerous. A knight who saw enemies in sleep might rise and pray until dawn, not because he feared madness, but because he feared sin. Maybe God sent the visions as a warning. Maybe the devil slipped into the dream through a crack in faith. And so he prayed harder, confessed more, sometimes to exhaustion. Imagine standing in a small stone chapel after midnight. The candles have burned low. The smell of wax and incense saturates the air. A man kneels, mud still clinging to his boots, his sword laying beside him, almost like a sleeping companion. His voice trembles as he whispers, "Show mercy." His confessor does not know what to say. There is no scripture for the sound of a horse screaming after being cut down. No psalm that erases this sight of blood soaking into straw. So the confessor listens, and that listening itself becomes an act of grace. Many monasteries quietly became sanctuaries for such men. Veterans might end their days as lay brothers, working in the gardens, copying manuscripts, sweeping cloisters lined with ivy. People said they sought repentance. Perhaps they simply sought quiet. But even among monastic silence, the past still had a voice. In summer bays, monks recorded, "A brother trembles when thunder falls," or "One cannot sleep for the sound of drums in his hearing." They meant it literally, the echo of battle disguised as nature. We tend to imagine medieval life as brief, brutal, resolute, but evidence in letters and poems reveals how sensitive their emotional vocabulary could be. The troubadours of Provence wrote of dolour, sorrow so deep it fused with identity. Chroniclers used words like tristitia gloom that blotted joy. Some theologians called it acedia, the deadly sloth of the soul, when one knew what was right but felt nothing. Many knights suffered that sort of emptiness after war. They prayed but felt no comfort. They confessed and still heard screaming. There are little records of their homecomings. A crusader might return to find the world smaller. Children groaned strange, songs unfamiliar, fields too peaceful to trust. People would rejoice at his survival, but the feast's laughter would sound too sharp. The clinking of cups like sword edges. When they asked for tales of glory, he'd manage a thin smile and say the battles were distant, and God had been good. In the quiet part after such feasts, he would walk outside, clouds masking the moon, maybe a dog barking somewhere far away, and in that long, trembling half-dark, he would see shadows and imagine armor moving. His hand might go automatically to his belt to a hilt that was no longer there. Chroniclers noticed how many warriors turned to penance in their later years, not pride in victory, but acts of humility. Some paid to rebuild the churches that their armies had burned. Some took vows of poverty. Others wandered as pilgrims until death found them on foreign roads. It wasn't always religious zeal. Often, it was guilt rewritten as holiness. They hoped perhaps that walking would exhaust memory, but memory is patient. When we read their wills, written in elaborate Latin by trembling hands, we find traces of that fear. Long lists of donations to hospitals and leper houses. Requests for prayers to be said eternally for sins of violence. Some included lines about the souls of men whose names they could no longer recall, only their faces. Imagine that, admitting guilt to the unknown dead. You sense the whisper, "I cannot name them, but they weigh upon me still." The body remembered too. Modern medicine would call it startle reflex, anxiety, cumulative trauma. They had no such words, only descriptions. Trembling of hands, fits when the bells rang, cold sweats that came like ghosts at dawn. Some sought cures through ritual bathing in sacred springs. Others burned herbs such as St. John's wort or mugwort to cast out invisible darkness. Anxious hearts sought the comfort of routine, sharpening blades not to fight, but to calm, holding beads in calloused fingers until prayer dulled the mind. The secrecy surrounding these behaviors tells us how misunderstood they were. A knight who wept would do so behind stone walls. A veteran who screamed at night would be said to suffer ill humors or haunting. Yet, among those who truly listened, wives, servants, priests, there must have been compassion. You can almost hear it in the gentle question, "Did you dream again, my lord?" They dreamed often, dreams where dawn never came, where banners hung torn across endless fields, where they saw the faces of those they'd killed alive and silent. Some even claimed the dead called their names, not in accusation, but in longing. They believed the battlefield souls wandered until released by prayer. So many spent fortunes sponsoring requiem masses, one for every fallen man, until the priests themselves lost count. Whole families bore the weight of one soldier's memories. The same way we might inherit debts or heirlooms, they inherited silence. Children learned not to ask why father drank so much wine before sleeping, or why he stared at the fire for hours. Wives learned that comfort was sometimes impossible. To touch a man who still fought in dreams could be dangerous. Some wounds bled only when touched by love. Let's imagine one such family, somewhere in the damp hills of England. A knight returned from France around the year 1410. He had been gallant once, bright surcoat, a falconer's grace. Now his left hand trembles too much to hold the cup steady. His wife, patient but cautious, sets his goblet down already full so he need not pour. When thunder rolls, he curses softly and leaves the room. At night, he whispers prayers so long that even his servants stop pretending to listen. One evening, his youngest son spies him in the chapel, pressing his brow against cold stone, whispering as though to someone beside him. The child cannot hear the words but sees the man tremble. He tells no one, and that silence becomes tradition. They called it trouble of the soul, and maybe that's still the best phrase for it. Many knights wrote devotional poems, some addressed to Christ on the cross. Not as savior, but as fellow sufferer. They compared war wounds to the passion itself, the torn flesh, the loneliness, the waiting for dawn. Others feared they shared not Christ's sanctity, but his abandonment. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Medieval religion made little room for trauma except as a test or punishment. Yet in private writing, we see flickers of recognition. Take the letters of crusading knights asking their confessors, "If I sinned in battle under fear, am I yet forgiven?" Fear itself was shameful. Chivalry demanded bravery, not trembling. So they denied fear's existence by giving it ritual shape, wearing blessed charms, reciting psalms before fights, attributing anxiety to unseen powers rather than their own hearts. Better to be haunted than afraid. And still, fear persisted. Some records mention a peculiar reaction. Knights who could no longer tolerate drums or horns. They'd leave mass during trumpet processions. They'd stand rigid at weddings when minstrels struck their lutes too sharply. Sound became wound. Light too. Probably the glint of metal on sunlight triggering the same breathless confusion. They began to build their lives around avoidance. Some avoided tournaments, claiming sickness. Some folks decided to hang up their boots early, finding reasons to manage their estates instead. Their friends called it wisdom, but maybe it was more about survival. You know how some stories end on a sweet note? There is this touching German tale about a veteran who spent his later years crafting tiny wooden figures of saints, each one small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. He never spoke of his war experiences again, but there was something haunting about his carvings. They all had downcast eyes. When he sold them, he'd say, "They listen, even when you're silent." You can imagine who he was thinking about, right? Fast forward to us, centuries later, and we've slapped a clinical label on that endless remembering, PTSD. But for them, it was all about fate, divine trials, or demons dancing around in their heads. In their confusion, they crafted rituals like night prayers, cherished relics, and pilgrimages that became their form of therapy. The church morphed into both a hospital and a mirror reflecting their struggles. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost feel it. Sandals shuffling on cold stone, whispers of Latin prayers, candlelight flickering like a heartbeat. Picture the monks chanting for the peace of souls, even for those still walking among us. And underneath that chant, there's a quieter sound, someone sobbing, a veteran searching for forgiveness. It's a powerful scene, isn't it? The candles, by now, have burned down to soft pools of wax. The air tastes faintly of smoke and midnight damp. Our story continues here, in the hush after confession, when even the walls seem to listen. The monks who tended to these haunted men sometimes wrote of change not sudden, not miraculous, but quiet. A sleepless night might, after months in an abbey's care, begin to smile faintly during morning prayers. Perhaps not because he believed himself forgiven, but because silence itself had become a kind of friendship. The human mind can live on little comforts, the steady toll of a bell, the scent of bread baking, the company of men who do not ask questions. There is something almost tragic about how the medieval world mixed faith and medicine in its search for healing. For them, to heal the soul was to heal the body. When a night trembled, physicians sometimes prescribed music, the gentle strumming of a lute by a window, to realign the humors. Others suggested sweet wine infused with herbs like sage, and lavender, something warm to settle the bile that clouded thought. If his mood darkened under the moon, the doctor might recommend sleeping with the shutters closed. For the moon's gaze draws out black vapors. The superstition seems strange now, but it came from a tender logic that nature could still the mind if properly respected. There were darker suggestions too. Some believed trauma to be contagion of the spirit that demons of the battlefield latched onto the surviving. In villages, families might call a priest to bless their homes, sprinkling holy water over a returning soldier's armor, fearing unseen malice. The ceremony brought comfort, yes, but it also deepened shame. To be blessed like a haunted relic must have been a lonely thing. Knighthood itself kept men from admitting weakness. A knight was meant to embody control, composure, discipline. We imagine them fierce and triumphant, but so many lived quietly broken beneath the plate. One chronicler described a veteran of the 100 Years' War whose heart grew heavy and the color of his eyes changed. Strange phrasing, but telling. Perhaps the scribe had seen how grief can rearrange a face, draining light from it. Let us follow such a man through memory. He wakes before dawn. It is nearly winter, and frost kisses the inside of his window. His wife still sleeps, her breath a small fog in cold air. He swings his legs over the bed and sits for a long time, elbows on knees, staring at the rushes on the floor. Outside, the stable boy is lighting the lantern. The faint neigh of horses drifts in soft, familiar and for a heartbeat. The night's breath catches. He is no longer in his chamber. He is back in a field slick with mud, and the sound of horses is fear, not warmth. His chest tightens until the memory pauses. Afterward, he feels foolish. He whispers a prayer as if to apologize to God for remembering. This happens to him every year when frost returns. He tells no one. Perhaps he doesn't even know it's a pattern, but his body remembers what his mind pretends not to. The language of memory in their century was terribly beautiful. People spoke not of flashbacks, but of visions of sin delayed. A poet called them shadows that walk more faithfully than friends. In moral terms, every returning thought was seen as evidence of guilt or temptation, a lack of faith. You can imagine how that must have hurt, to suffer, and to believe your suffering was proof of unworthiness. Yet, the church gave comfort to. In some monasteries, veterans were invited to read from the Psalms during vigils. The rhythm of those ancient lines, repeated night after night, acted like meditation. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, how fitting that those who had truly walked through it would mouth the words again and again, until they lost meaning or perhaps gained peace. One chronicler of a Crusader hospital in the Holy Land described the nights when soldiers, wounded or spared, cried out long after the fighting. The brothers tending them noted that they spoke of fires unseen, men without faces, and ground that trembled still. The caretaker tried prayers, holy oil, relics of saints. When these failed, he simply sat beside their beds and said nothing. That small act might have been the truest cure of all. Sometimes the kindest medieval medicine was presence. Let me linger on that idea for a moment, the presence that heals. Imagine two men sitting before a dying fire, no words. The logs hiss and settle. One man's hands shake. The other pretends not to notice. In the medieval world, silence had texture. It could be devotion, guilt, or understanding. In that silence, knights learned to live beside their ghosts rather than banish them. The records tell us of veterans who, decades later, still rode out to the fields at dawn in full armor, long after their strength had left them. Some said it was habit. Others said it was prayer. One old knight in Brittany used to ride to the same hill and sit there for hours, staring at the horizon. The villagers called him the Watcher. They said he waited for comrades lost at sea. But more likely, he just needed emptiness vast enough to hold memory without shattering it. That kind of quiet waiting became part of medieval aging. You could see it in manuscript illustrations, the old knight kneeling beside a chapel, a squire in the background holding his helm. Artists then understood, perhaps better than their patrons, that heroism decays into sorrow with time, and the body itself told stories. The tremor in the hand, the 1,000-yard stare before ink had a phrase for it. The startle at a slammed door. The armor of chivalry cracked in private. But what lay beneath was a pulse still shaped by war. We rarely think of armor as claustrophobic, but on the battlefield, men sweated and gasped inside metal as if entombed. The echo of breath rebounding from a closed helm could stay with them. Even months later, some nights could not sleep unless a blanket covered their faces, a strange reversal of comfort. Copying confinement, they had mistaken suffocation for safety. There is also the matter of ghosts, the literal ones. In chronicles and letters, soldiers spoke often of seeing the dead. They didn't mean it metaphorically. In castles and manors, apparitions were common explanations for post-battle visions. A man woken by nightmares might swear he saw the faces of fallen companions floating above him. Sometimes this bound him to piety, other times to madness. The local priest would bless the room and burn incense, thick smoke twisting through the rafters. They believed it would weigh down wandering spirits, so they could be swept from the house. In truth, it simply gave the living an excuse to breathe easier. Superstitions clung to survivors like second skin. Some knights carried charms beneath their tunics, small carved bones, crosses wrapped in silk, locks of a lover's hair. They served as anchors, physical reassurance that life still contained gentleness. Others avoided holy relics altogether, afraid relics might show them unworthy, afraid that a saint's presence might burn. And music was powerful. Many knights who survived battles were moved to tears by songs that spoke of peace. Troubadours noticed and began to perform gentler ballads at feasts after wars ended. Lyrics about lost comrades, though disguised as love songs. Across Europe, these melancholy tunes softened the air of victory, replaced boasting with mourning. Though no one said it aloud, war changed even sound itself. In towns, when bells rang for mass, it was meant as holy rhythm. Yet for soldiers, brass notes carried memory. Some closed their shutters at its first toll. Others fled from tournaments and fairs because the pounding of drums or cracking of whips made them real. Trauma twisted celebration into threat. They could never explain why. You can see echoes of this in the art they left behind. Frescoes depicting the Last Judgment grew more vivid during war-torn centuries, perhaps, because artists had seen judgment already. Christ above, serene yet stern, crowds below, caught between hope and flame. For knights, those images were not allegory, but memory disguised as theology. They blamed themselves, as all people do, because blaming themselves felt safer than accepting chaos. To believe that demons haunted you meant there was meaning somewhere. To believe only randomness meant there was none. As the years passed, the church slowly softened toward such souls. By the 15th century, some confessors began to note a difference between sin and sorrow. They would tell veterans, "You are not possessed, you are weary." That single word, weary, might have been the first hint of therapy. In France, one abbot even established a small hospice for men troubled by memory of arms, which sounds remarkably modern. They tended them with rest, prayer, and work gardening, illumination. Tending bees, the hum of hives seemed strangely fitting, a soothing sound beyond words. In that buzzing quiet, perhaps they found something like peace. The bees hum still, faint as memory. Their sound mingles with the sough of wind against cloister walls, a lullaby for broken men. Centuries later, historians leaf through old abbey rolls and pause on small notations entries about brothers who do not sleep easily, who work longer hours in gardens, who request permission to attend extra vigils. The monks never wrote why these men prayed twice as long, only that they did. But you and I can guess. Prayer was less about devotion than endurance. A tired soul repeats what feels safe. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy. The words, whispered over and over, became a rhythm to replace the ringing of swords. The mind may not forget, but it can sometimes be lulled. In that rhythm, be it prayer, or marching feet, or scribes copying ink, there lies a strange comfort. If you listen closer to medieval writings, you find soft traces of panic carefully disguised as piety. A soldier writes that he cannot attend Mass, for when the bell sounds, my heart runs before me. Another writes that he dares not ride through woods, for I see faces among the trees. One monk describes a night trembling during thunder, muttering, hear them clash again. They thought lightning held the souls of warriors, still fighting in the heavens. For the medieval mind, the world shimmered with unseen meaning. Every sign, every chill, every dream had divine or demonic purpose. And so, when a man awoke sweating and gasping, he sought reason not in the nerves, but in the cosmos. He might blame the alignment of stars, the corruption of air, or the wrath of a forgotten saint. Better that than to believe chaos lived inside him. Treatment followed faith. Priests performed rites of blessing. Healers offered amulets of jet or coral to absorb black spirits. Physicians prescribed good airs and garden walks. Some veterans found solace in pilgrimages, long, aching journeys that mirrored the inner walking they could never stop. A pilgrimage gave meaning to restless legs and nights when sleep refused to visit. They trudged toward holy shrines under rain and dust, telling themselves the destination mattered when, in truth, it was the walking that soothed them, the sound of steps erasing thought. Others sought redemption through charity. Former soldiers funded hospitals, bridges, wells. In every stone laid, perhaps they hoped a piece of memory might be buried. Towns grew from their guilt. Whole monasteries owe their cloisters to sleeplessness. Sometimes, though, sorrow found other paths. Drinking was a common comfort. Wine dulled what prayer could not. In taverns from Paris to Prague, old campaigners sat hunched over cups, their laughter rough and brief. In that clamor, no one could hear their hearts drum. There was a saying among chroniclers, the bravest mouths speak loudest in alehouses. Underneath the bravado, you can sense the fear of silence. But not all suffering hardened. Some nights, changed forever, turned unexpectedly gentle. Many chroniclers noted that after long wars, warriors wept at small things. A bird landing on a window ledge, a child stumbling. They were touched too quickly, sensitive to the world's quiet signals, because they had seen what happens when such signals vanish. The humility that followed horror sometimes birthed holiness. In one parish, an anonymous veteran paid for an altar dedicated not to victory, but to mercy. The inscription read simply, "For those unnamed who sleep beneath grass known to no one but God." Here, finally, you glimpse release not through glory, but through grace. In that era, art began to change too. You can almost watch it shifting in illuminated manuscripts, saints portrayed with gentler eyes, angels kneeling beside weary soldiers, Christ not triumphant, but tender. Artists drew from what they saw, broken bodies, slower movements, the soft collapse after battle's frenzy. They may not have named trauma, but they understood ache. And in villages, stories softened. The epic poems of conquest gave way to tales of moral wandering. Knights searching not for dragons to slay, but peace they can never quite find. Those legends pass evil. The Grail quest echo, the same wound. The knights keep riding because they fear stopping. Stillness is when memory catches them. One can imagine a listener by a hearth, long after midnight, hearing those stories and nodding quietly. They recognize themselves in the lost wanderers. At home, families learned adaptation. A wife who noticed her husband shudder at sudden noise might weave gentler rhythms into daily tasks. She'd open the shutters slowly, speak softly when waking him. Children might tiptoe, thinking it kindness rather than fear. Through such small tendernesses, households became sanctuaries. Though there were great wars across Christendom, healing always began in kitchens by fires that hummed with remembrance. Simple domestic rituals acted as anchors, polishing armor not for battle, but as habit, saying grace over every meal, mending clothes by hand. Every repetition was a prayer disguised as routine. And perhaps only perhaps those acts tamed nightmares more effectively than holy water. Still, there were men who could not stay. The roads of Europe were full of wanderers dressed in half-armor. Half-rags retired soldiers who carried swords only as memories. They slept in barns, told fragmentary tales to strangers. Some called them mad, others called them pilgrims. They belonged nowhere because their mind's horizon was still ringing with trumpet calls. One such traveler appears briefly in a record near Avignon. The clerk wrote, "A man came claiming to have served in the wars of the cross, yet bore no cross upon him. He asked to ring the church bell once and left before dawn." What a haunting image, that single toll for unseen comrades. Something in that sound must have felt like closure. Medieval wisdom eventually learned to fold such pain into its theology. By the late Middle Ages, writers began distinguishing between diabolical torment and natural melancholy. They didn't understand trauma, but they recognized heartbreak. And that recognition is the seed of compassion. A hospital rule from 1480 reads, "Be gentle with those who cannot sleep, for they have kept watch enough in their days." Imagine those words recited aloud in stone halls as new monks took their vows. Generations remembering, however dimly, that mercy was learned through suffering. If you listen outside the hospital, you might hear the sigh of wind through fig leaves, the murmur of water from a courtyard fountain. Inside, men lie awake but peaceful, not cured, never cured but calmer. Their ghosts quieter tonight. And so, the centuries pass, candles turn to dust, scripts fade. Yet the pattern endures: the restless, the repentant, the remembering. Always, humanity writes itself into sleep, hoping ink and prayer can bind the unspeakable as our story drifts toward stillness. Think of those medieval souls as our kin. They carried their fears through incense and storm, through superstition and belief. Yet what they wanted was the same peace you want tonight. A few hours of rest without ghosts. A world briefly without echoes. If your eyelids grow heavy now, let them. The monks still sing under distant arches. The bells still toll faintly somewhere in the dark. The nights have come home at last. The battles are finished, though their dreams may never quite be. Now, let the sound of their distant prayers fade into quiet. The armor is set aside. The fields lie empty. The candle burns low. And if your mind still wanders tonight, remember you are not the first to lie awake listening to echoes. Humans have always done so. It's only part of remembering, part of being alive. So breathe gently. The past won't harm you here. The nights are sleeping now, each one forgiven, each one dreaming of fields before the wars began. If your eyes are heavy, you can let them close. The torches and the crows, the prayers and the clashing steel can dissolve into the dark for tonight. And when the bells ring again, they will not be a summons to arms, but a call to rest.